human skeleton consists of two parts, the axial part and the appendicular part. Axial part includes the skull, the thoracic cage, and the vertebral column or spine. Okay, so those three parts belong to the axial. Appendicular part includes the upper extremities and lower extremities. Okay, so these two are upper extremities and these two are lower extremities. Okay, first we'll talk about the axial bones. That means the bones of the skull, bones of the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. So in the skull you have two sets of bones, the cranial bones that form the cranial cavity in which the brain is located. So cranial bones protect the brain, and the facial bones form the framework of your face, as well as facial bones protect your sensory organs, your eyes, your nose, your tongue. Those organs, sensory organs, are protected by the facial bones. So in the skull you have two groups or sets of bones. Cranial bones protect the brain, and facial bones protect the sensory organs as well as give the framework of your face. Okay, there are 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. Then you have the bones of your thoracic cage. In each side you have 12 ribs, so you have total 24 ribs, and in the middle where the ribs are attached you have the sternum. So this bone is called the sternum, and ribs are connected to the sternum by the cartilages called the costal cartilages. Okay, so 24 ribs and the sternum, those are the bones of your thoracic cage. And then in the vertebral column or spine you have 7 cervical vertebrae in the neck part, 12 thoracic vertebrae in the thoracic part, and then in the lumbar area you have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then you have a large triangular bone, that is the sacrum, and all the way in the bottom you have tiny tailpiece bones, those are called the coccyx. The number of coccyx varies person to person between 3 to 6 tiny pieces. Okay, sometimes 2 of them join together to form 1. That's why the number of coccyx may vary. So those are the bones of the axial skeleton. So let me now go over the skull. Okay, so this is a human skull, and the skull has 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. First we'll see the cranial bones. This yellow colored bone is called the frontal bone. The forehead is formed by the frontal bone, as well as the upper boundary of the orbital fossa. This is the orbital fossa where the eyeball is housed. Okay, so the upper boundary of the orbital fossa is formed by the frontal bone, and this line is called the supraorbital margin. So supraorbital margins, and the area between two supraorbital margins is called the glabella. So this is the glabellar supraorbital margins. Okay. So this is the frontal bone. Then behind the frontal bone you have two parietal bones, these two. And then below the parietal bone you have the temporal bone. This is the temporal bone and this is another temporal bone. So you have two parietals and two temporals. Okay. And in the back this one is called the occipital bone. Okay. So you got six: one frontal, two parietals, two temporals, and one occipital. Then two other bones are the sphenoid, which forms the floor of the cranial cavity. So this red one, which looks like a butterfly or bat, this bone is called the sphenoid. And if you look through the nasal cavity, there is a yellow colored bone, that is the ethmoid. So ethmoid is here and sphenoid is in the middle part of the floor of the skull. Okay, so those are 8 cranial bones. Now if you see the facial bones, there are 14 facial bones, and the facial bones, as I mentioned already, form the framework of your face and also form the houses for the sensory organs. So let's see the facial bones in this colored skull. So these two are called the zygomatic bones, cheek bones. The prominence of your cheek is given by these two bones. These two are the nasal bones, from the bridge of your nose. So two nasal bones, two zygomatic bones or cheek bones. Then you have two maxillary bones. They eventually fuse to form one piece that is called the maxilla. So this whole thing is the maxilla, and it is formed by the fusion of two maxillary bones. Okay, and maxillary bones form the upper jaw, and upper teeth are attached to the maxilla. Where the upper teeth are attached to the maxilla, that area is called the alveolar margin. Okay, and this is the mandible. The lower jaw bone is the mandible. This is the strongest bone of the face and only movable bone of the skull. So this is the only bone of the skull that moves, and you know we move this bone a lot when we speak, when we eat or chew the food, right? We move the mandible. Okay, and inside the nasal cavity you have nasal concha, two pairs, nasal concha. Also inside the nasal cavity you have a plough-shaped bone that is called the vomer. Also there are two bones here, you see the orange color. These are called the lacrimal bones. Okay, so let's see again. Two nasal bones form the bridge of the nose. Two zygomatic or cheek bones form the prominence of the cheek. Two lacrimal bones, they form the medial wall of the orbital fossa. Then you have two maxillary bones from the maxilla or upper jaw. You have the mandible, only movable and the strongest bone of the face. Inside the nasal cavity you have two nasal concha, two pairs of nasal concha and plough-shaped bone that forms the partition of the nasal cavity, and that is called the vomer. Okay, so those are the facial bones. Now we'll see how the cranial bones are connected by the sutures. Sutures are the joints connect the cranial bones. So this is the frontal bone, and frontal bone is connected to the parietal bones by this suture or joint that is called the coronal suture. And then two parietal bones are connected by this suture in the midline, and this is called the sagittal suture. Sagittal suture. So this is coronal suture, this is sagittal suture. Then the temporal and parietal are connected here, and that is called the squamous suture. Okay. In the back, now let's see the back. In the back, your occipital is connected to the parietal by this suture that is called the lambdoid suture. Okay. So those are the sutures on the skull, you can see, and they connect different cranial bones. Okay. Okay, now let's see those bones. In this skull, this one is not colored, so it is more challenging. However, you got a good idea on the colored skull where the bones are located. So first let's see the cranial bones. This is the frontal bone, supraorbital, supra means above, orbital fossa, so supraorbital margins, glavilla, forehead area. So this is the frontal bone, and the upper or upper boundary of the orbital fossa is formed by the frontal bone. Okay. Then this is the coronal suture here, this line. It connects the frontal and two parietals. So these are two parietal bones connected by this suture. This is called the sagittal suture. Okay. And then this is the temporal bone here, and you see this suture is connecting the parietal and temporal. So this suture is called the squamous suture. Okay, here connecting the parietal and temporal. Okay, and then in the back you have the occipital bone, and this suture that connects the parietal, two parietals to the occipital, this is called the lambdoid suture. Okay. Now if you see the back of the occipital bone, here you see a small elevated structure. This is called the external occipital protuberance. Okay, this small elevation, you can feel it in the back of your skull. And then from the external occipital protuberance, faint lines go like this, and these are called the nuchal lines. There are two pairs, superior nuchal lines and inferior nuchal lines. Okay, and then you have a large foramen in the occipital bone. From the brain, the spinal cord gets out from the skull through this foramen. This is called foramen magnum. Magnum means big. Okay, and foramen is round or almost round opening. So that is the occipital bone. And the sphenoid is located here in the middle of the floor of the skull. Okay, sphenoid, which looks like a butterfly or a bat. Okay, and ethmoid is mostly located in the roof of the nasal cavity here. Okay, so those are 8 cranial bones. Then we'll see the facial bones. This is a zygomatic bone. This is another one, zygomatic bone. They form the cheek, prominence of cheek. 2 nasal bones form the bridge of the nose here. Then you have two lacrimal bones from the medial wall, part of the medial wall of the orbital fossa. Okay. Then you have two maxillary bones from the upper jaw, okay, which is the maxilla, and where the teeth are attached to the maxilla, that border is called the alveolar margin. Okay. And then inside the nose you have two pairs of conchae, nasal conchae, and then you have the bony part of the nasal septum, that is the vomer. Okay. And then this is the only movable bone of the skull, that is the mandible, lower jaw bone. Okay. So those are the bones of the skull. Now I'll go over few individual bones. Let me take out this one. This is the temporal bone, so I'll take it out. So temporal bone has upper portion which is just a flat bone, that is called the squamous part, and there are few structures, all are located in the lower part of the bone. Okay. There are three processes. Processes are the bony structures that projects or stake out from the main part. This one is going to the zygomatic bone, that's why this is called the zygomatic process. Okay. This one very sharp pointed, this is called the styloid process, and this one is kind of blunt, this is called the mastoid process. Okay, so three processes: zygomatic, styloid, mastoid. Mastoid process you can actually press behind your ear with your finger and feel this elevation there. And then you have the external acoustic meatus, outer ear canal here. Okay, so that is the temporal bone. Then let's see the occipital bone. So this is the occipital bone, this is inner surface, and this is the outer surface. So you see it is a flat but curved. Most of the flat bones are curved. Here this is the external occipital protuberance, and you have the nuchal lines, faint lines, superior and inferior nuchal lines, and this is the foramen magnum. Okay, and the spinal cord gets out from the brain stem or brain through this foramen magnum. Okay. Parietal bones don't have any feature. These are parietal bones. Okay, and they are connected by the sagittal suture here. Okay, and parietal bones are flat, simple flat bones, and it is curved. Okay, so curved flat bones are parietal bones. Then we'll see the bat or butterfly shaped bone. This is the red one, sphenoid. Okay, sphenoid bone, and this one is the ethmoid. So sphenoid bone looks like a flying bat or butterfly. It has a body. On the top of the body, upper surface of the body, there is a fossa. It is called the hypophyseal fossa for the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland sits here. Why it is called hypophyseal fossa? Because another name of pituitary is hypophysis. Okay, so your pituitary gland is located here. And the back of the body, this part is called sella tarsica. Sella tarsica. Okay. Then it has two lesser wings. These are smaller wings, and two greater wings, the bigger ones. So lesser wings and greater wings. And here, if you see, just under the medial part of the lesser wing, you have nice canal. These are called the optic canals. From the eye, the optic nerves enter into the brain through these canals. So that's why they are called the optic canals here. Very nice round, okay? And also under the lesser wing, you have slit. These are called the fissures. Fissures are, slit-like opening, not round. Round is foramen, and elongated opening is called a fissure. So you see here, if you can look, you see it's like an elongated slit or opening. So superior orbital fissure. Okay. And then you have foramen oval. You see oval shaped foramen in the back part of the greater wing. So two foramen oval. So those are the main parts of the sphenoid bone. Body, upper surface of the body has the hypophyseal fossa for the pituitary. Back part is called the sella tarsica, and two lesser wings, two greater wings, okay, two optic canals for the optic nerves, and superior orbital fissures, okay, and you have also foramen oval. Now we'll see the maxilla. So this is the maxilla, which is formed by two maxillary bones, right? So these are two maxillary bones. They get fused together to form the maxilla. Inside the maxillary bone, you have the largest sinus or cavity inside the bone. That is called the maxillary sinus, air-filled cavity. And that's why this bone is light, not too heavy. And the upper teeth are attached to the maxilla, and this area where the upper teeth are attached is called the alveolar margin, okay? And this part is going to the zygomatic bone. That's why this part is called the zygomatic process of maxilla, okay? So most of the cases we name the process by the bone it is heading to or going to. So this part is getting attached to the zygomatic bone here. That's why zygomatic process of maxilla. And you see this part is going to the frontal bone here. So that's why this is called the frontal process, okay? So just in the upper part of the front of the maxilla or maxillary bone, you have infraorbital foramen. Why this is called infraorbital? Because your orbital fossa is here and infra means below, okay? So infraorbital foramen here, okay? So that is about maxilla. Now the mandible, the lower jaw bone. This is the strongest and only movable bone of the skull, and it has a body part and two ramus. Arm-like parts are called the ramus, okay? So first let's see the body. on the upper surface of the body, the lower teeth are attached, and this area is, again, this area is called alveolar margin of the mandible. And in the body, you see here, you have two foramen. These are called the mental foramen. You know, the chin area is called the mental area, so these foramen are called the mental foramen. Now let's see the ramus, arm-like part. In the upper part of the ramus, you have two structures here. The anterior one is called the coronoid process. It is flat and it is not attached to any bone. In the back, you have a round one. This is called the mandibular condyle, or condyle of the mandible, and this one articulates with the temporal bone to form the temporomandibular joint, or TMJ. We'll see that soon. And in the inner surface of the ramus, you have a foramen that is called the mandibular foramen. So two mandibular foramen, two mental foramen. Okay, two mental and two mandibular. Now we'll see how the temporomandibular joint is formed. Its name is temporomandibular joint, and this mandibular condyle goes into the mandibular fossa in the temporal bone like this, and this is the temporomandibular joint here. Okay, this is the temporal bone, and this is the mandible, and this is the joint TMJ. This joint has a clinical significance, that is called locked jaw. Sometimes if you open the mouth, you can't close it. That is called locked jaw. That happens in this joint. Okay, and this is the only joint where the bone moves in the skull. Okay, so those are the main bones and their parts in the skull. This is the vertebral column, or the spine. In the neck part, you have 7 cervical vertebrae. Then you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. Okay, and below that, in the lumbar part, you have 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then sacrum and coccyx. Okay, so we'll see some of those vertebrae. First, let's see. There are 7 cervical vertebrae. First and second one, they are different than other 5, and they have their own features. So we'll talk about C1 and C2, that means first cervical and second cervical letter. Other 5 look like this. Okay, this is called the body of the vertebrae, and in cervical vertebrae the body is small, and this is called the spinous process. In case of cervical, you see the spinous process is divided or split or bifid. So the end of the spinous process is divided like this. Okay, and another feature is this foramen called the transverse foramen in the transverse process. Okay, these are called the transverse processes. So in the transverse processes, you have foramen, transverse foramen. Okay, for the vertebral artery. Vertebral arteries go to the brain through these transverse foramen. Okay, so again, this is one of the 5 cervical vertebrae, and small body. The spinous process is split, and transverse foramen. If you see these things, this is a cervical vertebrae. Now we'll see C1 and C2. As I told you, those two are different than other 5. So this is called C1, first cervical vertebrae, uppermost vertebrae of the vertebral column. And why it is different? It is different because this is the only vertebrae which doesn't have any body. So the body is not present in C1, and its name is atlas. Okay, so atlas is C1, no body. However, it has two arches. Okay, the posterior arch is bigger and the anterior arch is smaller. So no body, two arches, and since there is no body, this vertebral foramen is very big, okay, compared to others. Okay, you see here, this one is much bigger. Okay, so this is the atlas. This is C2. This is also different than other vertebrae. How? A finger-like structure sticks up from the body. So this is the body, and from the body a structure is extended upwards, and that is called the dens or the odontoid process. Okay, so if you see this, this is C2. It is also called an axis. Okay, so atlas is C1, axis is C2. Now, why this is called axis? Because your head rotates around this dens like this. So this is the axis, and this dens is actually attached to the C1. You see, in the anterior arch, in the back of the anterior arch, there is a facet here where the dens is attached like this. Okay, so your dens gets attached to the back of the anterior arch like this. Okay, and your C1 can move like this. So when you rotate your head, it moves like this. Okay, now this is a very weak point in your body. Just think that if C2 moves backward like this, then it will crash the spinal cord here. Okay, and in this part of your very upper part of the spinal cord, which is very close to the brainstem, you have the respiratory and cardiac centers. So this is your spinal cord, and if you move this C2, it will crush the spinal cord. Make sense? So it will destroy the spinal cord. So this is a dangerous area in your body. Okay, so C1, C2, and then we'll see a thoracic vertebrae. This is a thoracic vertebrae. There are 12, and in thoracic vertebrae you will see the spinous process is long and directed downwards and slightly backwards. This is actually the back part. This is the body, is the front of the vertebrae. So this is the body. This is how in your body, okay, in my body. So vertebrae has a body, and body is anteriorly. Okay, and this is the spinous process. In case of thoracic, the spinous process is long, okay, directed downwards and backwards, and the end is pointed. In case of cervical, you must remember the spinous process is divided, split, but in case of thoracic, it is pointed. Okay, and in transverse process, no transverse foramen. In case of cervical, you had transverse foramen. Remember, nice foramen. In cervical, in thoracic, no such foramen. So this is a thoracic vertebrae. Okay, and then a lumbar. There are 5 lumbar, and this is one of those. It is a massive vertebrae. The body is massive, big, and the spinous process is short and not pointed, not divided. It is rather flat. Okay, so short, flat spinous process, and the body is big and massive. So easy to identify. Now let's put three groups, one from each group. First, this is a cervical. How you know? The spinous process is divided and transverse foramen. Okay, and the body is smaller. See, if you compare these three bodies, this is the smallest body. Okay, but small big is a relative term. If it is from a small guy, then it is difficult to say. This is thoracic, long, pointed end in the spinal cord, and this is lumbar. Body is big, spinous process is short and not pointed, not divided, rather flat. Okay. Now I will show you the parts of a typical vertebrae. A vertebrae has a body, which is the front part of the vertebrae, and the arch is this part, and in the arch you have 7 processes. What are those 7 processes? This one is the spinous process, you already know. These two are called the transverse processes, going like this, transverse. And then 2 are going upwards, called the superior articular processes. You see here, these 2 superior articular processes. And then here you have the inferior articular processes. So again, these are transverse, this is spinous, these are superior articular, and these are inferior articular processes. 7 processes, and 2 more structures where the body is attached to the rest part. This structure or bony part is called the pedicle. So you have pedicles that connects the body to the rest part. And here you see the transverse process and the spinous process are connected by this part. This is called lamina. So lamina and pedicle. Okay, so those are the parts of a typical vertebrae. Now we'll see the sacrum. So after 5 lumbar, you have the sacrum. So if this is 5th lumbar vertebrae, sacrum is just next to the 5th or last lumbar vertebrae. And sacrum is attached to the lumbar vertebrae by lumbosacral joint. Makes sense, right? This is lumbar vertebrae, last one, and this is sacrum. So this joint is called the lumbosacral joint. Okay, and the sacrum is a large triangular shaped bone. Actually, it is formed by the fusion of 5 sacral vertebrae. So 5 sacral vertebrae were separated in early part of your life, early stage of your life, then they got fused to each other, and where they fused, you can see the lines. Those are called the transverse ridges. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and this is the front, which is concave, and this is the back. So first let's see the front. These are the transverse ridges, and these are the ventral sacral foramina. Okay, ventral sacral foramina. And in the back, these are dorsal sacral foramina. Okay, and in the back you have in the middle of the back, you have this structure that is called the median sacral crest. Median sacral crest. These are actually the spinous process of those vertebrae, okay, form the median sacral crest. And at the lower end, you see this U-shaped structure that is called the sacral hiatus. So through the sacral hiatus, spinal nerve roots, and also through the sacral foramina, the spinal nerve roots get out. Now let's see the front. This is the front, and the upper part of the front, you have this structure which is like, extended forward. This is called the sacral promontory, this extended part which is more forward. So this is sacral promontory, and these two areas are called ala of the sacrum. Okay, so that is the sacrum. And then you have coccyx or coccygeal bones here. The number varies, as I mentioned before. Okay, so those are the bones of your axial skeleton. Okay.